Chapter 3, Gesundheit, Westfalen, Arkansas, 12:07 a.m., November 26, 1941, and sometime later. Frigidity, Nagumo, Tendril, Shagiakashitas, newborns, seafloor creature, grubby tadpoles, pumping twin. It might have been quiet, but at least it was very cold. This quietness and coldness lay thick on the hillside and thickened the solitude flowing down to the town, becoming more dark and more without motion. Unlit wisps of cirrus clouds protected much of the darkness by apparently smothering the torrents of light scattered from the war of the trillion titan suns and their trillion galaxies that dangled overhead by who knows what in their gelatinous time. The earth being tethered and swung through these threaded torrents, each dim thread enduring eternity, and being drawn thin by it. And for some, for each trillion of those some, comes a sudden death in an unseen and silent glint on an unattended facet of frost. The darkness and cold and solitude flowed in through the brittle walls and windows of the parsonage, wherein the fireplace was powerless against them. Its charred and fatigued remains exhaled miniature torches that sprayed oranges and yellows quietly, signaling the falling of chunks to contribute to the amber cauldron of coals below. The embers unclutched an amber glow, painting a faint wash onto one side of her breath as its billows of condensation pulsed up through the frigid and heavier air. Sap vapors and their tiny pops compressed sound spit out from deep inside the hot drying wood, and did little to obscure the breathy sounds released from the oldest parts of her, exciting the walls buried in the viscous black of the frozen parsonage. The top of her sweaty head was augured deep into the pillow, and her hands looked to be clenching his lower back beneath the blankets, as if guiding him along the contours of their archetypal and communal wave. Her guidance seemed specific and surely innate, and shared by the community of creatures still watching through ancient shortcuts in her wiring. Her speech became untethered from their common language, as did his. The tongues of their parents began shaping the quiet bursts of their breathing. Her expression seemed narrowed to a tiny spot, as has happened with all who preceded her, the kneading of sensation into swelling folds, rendering her ignorant of everything but this, suspended in the awareness shared by all like creatures of that gentle and pulsing nodule, building like a sneeze, for an eternal instant until the pulse looked to trip over itself to wash as ripples throughout her contracting body. It was obvious to all absent onlookers that this affected him, like sharing a nod, as a wordless urging burst from the basal wiring of his predecessors. He relaxed his arms and crouched as if not to crush her. They were surely hot under the covers. "Arigato," said he in an Italian accent. The word flickered as its cloud billowed up to the ceiling. She laughed exhaustedly. Her "grazie" was painted with Japanese and transformed to umber vapor as it chased upwards after his. One thing led to another, and then a new tip of the tendril of millennial life began condensing. Each morning, Giuseppe bent over the bathroom sink and pressed his open eye against the top of its spigot, or did appear to do so, for a time, and then resumed the morning rituals common to most in his part of the world at his time in history. As days flickered, if one were so disposed, one could begin to discern a turquoise hair risen erect atop the spigot's freckled alloy arch, thinly standing, jagged and unsure, in a stack of tiny and delicate cubes, cream and green, grabbing onto each other in the way to which only diminutives can seem to resort, disposed of most every tool save the seeming supernatural, stuck without tack or tack, but by unseen affinity that is true nonetheless, a truth on the order of the presence of one's own thought, no doubt. Once or twice early on he wiped the spigot clean, as any solid person would do, but its numinous rebirth from atop the solid metal must have been enough not to be ignored, and that was when Giuseppe took to his intimate lane of his eye upon the conjured turquoise hair, or so it appeared. Kumi did not speak of the notion of the hair or matters relating, and looked to not exhaust herself with Giuseppe's monologues circumscribing his bathroom sprite-like economy. Her body's actions were more that of gear-works, as if being maintained by journeyman parts of her, while her imagining looked engaged in lively matters hidden between the folds of air churning in front of her. She wandered between parsonage walls that formalized its grand room's smallness, and were so close as to frustrate perspective, and articulated the whole of the home as a single room, save the turquoise economy's closet latrine. Lately, one would see her behind the school's workshop, wafted by white and purple-gray smokes from barrels tucked into hot alcoves carved out of hillocks, where she would engage in the manufacture of meaning and freeze it into form and color. If meaning were to be found beyond sacrifice and its concomitants of sensation, if meaning could be bestowed upon objects inert, then her vessels, cast into the fibers of a mind, could surely tether hard and disparate notions and confront each with the other, and force their measured concession to the other's archaic worth. The smokes were thick as they exhaled from dense heat called for by her recipes of glazes, cooked just as they had been by her ancients, and so just as they were by her ancients still, but for some adaptation to local scarcities of a powder or crystal here or there. Kumi appeared to be expert in its chemistry, and was gifted a husband who practiced the teaching of the chemical arts at this school. And so she would wander amongst his stock and emerge on occasion with rough substitute for a scarcity, and heed inspiration to conjure new recipes of her own, where quicksilver expressed rainbows and plumum led colors to more evenly flow. It could have been this that guided Kumi's attentions, while awaiting the barrel kiln shamans to dream their transformations into her clays. She took to staring for long spells at the kiln's council of stovepipes, shaking their headdresses of flames, erect like orange feathers plucked from some denuded bird of fire, as surely her thoughts disengaged and were adrift through the leaning stands of gray and purple smoke. There were days of this, and as if her ancestors could no longer condone this affront to their intricate and delicate undertaking deep within her, she began throwing up. One could fathom that Kumi by now knew that she was with child. One morning, at home in the parsonage, while Kumi stood at the tiny sink, wiping what may have been bile from her lips and washing likely tart remains down the drain, she looked down to between her legs to the floor, and startled, and called out Giuseppe's name. Jess, come here." Giuseppe peeked across the full extent of the tiny home to between Kumi's feet, where a puddle lay spreading, and saw it to be fed by a tiny stream at the base of several tiny falls of water dripping from within the tiny counter under the sink. "Jesus, Jessie, this place." "I know." "When are we going to get out of this chicken coop?" "I know, sweetie. I know." "When?" when we have enough money. Have you even looked for a place? No, have you? A golden silence emerged from the question and spread out across the floor and walls and ceiling and began working its way into the endless gaps and crevices of the room, and yet did not appear to diminish, but instead became more dense and more consuming, and slowly became far less golden. Come on, Kumi, we haven't even been here 4 months. This place is free, for heaven's sake. It's overpriced. We're lucky to have this place. It's shelter, it's close to work. We're saving money as long as we stay here. You call this shelter? Yes, I do. It serves our purposes for now. If we give it time, we'll be in great shape, especially if you start selling your pots. My pots aren't selling, so this house is my fault. Okay, I've caught up. Jesus, I'm just saying it's going to take both of us if you went out of here anytime soon. Your soon or my soon. But I'm not complaining. I think it's great. It's pretty perfect, really. The puddle is growing. Giuseppe nudged in front of Kumi and squatted before the haboob of the pond, accruing on the floor below the cabinet doors that were warped and springy like day-old tortillas, and they opened with complaint, and he surveyed the piping there configured in something of a large occidental pictograph upon which he cast an ignorant gaze. There visible were boisterous tufts of cream and green crystalline hairs presenting as unfashioned beards sprouting like frozen explosions of turquoise out from the backdrop of black mold and from the copper joint chins of mountain akashitas, surely awaiting the flood all knew was coming. Droplets were forming on the underside of the sink, seemingly without origin, springing from the ether as if conjured, or so it appeared, as Giuseppe's eyes drew lines from the droplets to each hairy feature of the pictograph, and his seeking settled on one turquoise beard from which a mouth was quarried, and from it sprayed a hypothetical thread of water up onto the underside of the sink, such that the sperm-shaped droplets coalesced and dripped in perfect accordance with the sum of all circumstance the universe at this place and time had apportioned to bear upon them. Holy Jesus, Kumi, this is so strange. I'm not sure I know what to do with this. We could leave it and go find another place to live. We could call a plumber if we had a telephone. Giuseppe picked at a tooth and cycled through a breath audibly, and the sound of it quickly rebounded for some time within the hardness and closeness of the parsonage walls. So I guess I'll go into town and find a plumber. I'll watch the puddle. Kumi, could you find it within yourself to give a shit and find a large pot to catch the water? Kumi looked as if she were in close abidance with the commands of her master, and her husband seemed not to hold that post as she began tapping the firm surface of the puddle with her big toe, urging the ripples therefrom to progress toward making the puddle's full destiny manifest. Giuseppe further cycled through breaths and clamored the rummage of a pot from the other cubby and placed it proximal to the audience of mineral akashitas looking out from their chinny turns in the pipeworks. Giuseppe then provided to Kumi's demeanor theatrical retort using concussive footfalls while exiting the front door, and he forth went out upon the trail that processed through the deep gully and up through the field that lay behind the Bricken School, where its governors had so far unerringly underwrote his vocation. Kumi tweaked the blinds and peered in his direction, and once the light fugitive from his person no longer invigorated her retinal chemistry, she walked out the door and toward the workshop. Kumi entered the still soulless workshop and punched through the swinging doors and thudded her heels to negotiate the simple labyrinth of the empty school to a room landscaped with flasks and tubules and burners without flame. She clambered open large drawers enough, no doubt, to redeem her husband's outrages against her, with a recompense of 4 beakers and 2 pipettes and sweet lead and quicksilver and a powder of copper, and gathered each precariously and maintained an animated pace back to the large shop, where she addressed a workbench the size of a truck bed that already bore evidences of previous sessions of incantation, as the evidences seemed splashed without management and colored in accordance to their pedigrees and dried in layers and thus suitable for some upcoming archaeology. High behind her on deep shelves, silted with potter's talc, sat scores of round-bellied pots, newborn into many species of shape and size, and squatted immobile in their bodies of silicates that had been gorged from creek beds, accreted by nature hereabouts and elsewhere, each newborn squatting dry and stiff and motionless, as if panicked, no doubt traumatized by their night in the underworld, where everything glowed the orange of their mythologies, some still rough and striated with eternally circumscribed fingerprints, and some smoothed dense as if by long rubs with tiger's eye, and most newborns watched her dabble in some dark art intended for, one could only presume, their coming entrapment in frozen and long plagiarized meaning. Seated on a stool at the thick timbers of the workbench, she slid to her a clipboard, feathered with spent and stained paper sheets, curled as if they were once scrolls, and she pulled from the leftmost dog-hole a pencil thick beyond reason, and sheathed with thin wood, but cord with a slab of carbon ridiculous in its heft, that had facets of long rhomboids narrowing to an edge as minuscule as to require theory to recount. And she jotted things no doubt crucial, and she began to convolute her powdered and liquid coup into beakers in precise ways known only to her and to her graphene memories, and she was delicate in her movements, and she stirred the mixtures until they became their own likenings, unique in ways surely matching notions preserved beneath the fatty sulky of her mind works, or in her dark and atom-thick scribbles. She scribbled her accounts for some time until they appeared to have drained from her fully, and lay drug and caked on the curls of paper, and she changed her posture as if ready, and fingered from a jar half empty with murk a strange spheroid that was porous and looked once golden, and that looked born from a seafloor, but without organs used for sensing, and she squeezed its juices from it and shook the juices to the floor's flaked concretes, and she acquainted this spent creature with the mouth of a beaker, and tilted the beaker such that it laid its own juices upon the creature, as surely, too, did the juices pour beneath her sulky, and the creature took the juices in and soon dripped with them, and after a time of this seemed sated. 4 rows of newborns squatted at the table's edge while watching her like an anxious roll call of prisoners, and perhaps still startled from their sudden whirling into existence and subsequent basking in a low-fired hell. With her dry hand she pulled to her one newborn and acquainted it with the sated seafloor creature, and began rubbing the creature in deliberate ways upon the chalk of the newborn's skin, that sopped the creature's fluids until the newborn changed its own tones, and until it was also sated, and then was set aside, presumably to give it time to consider what had just happened. Kumi did this for every newborn, and provided a sopping unique to each of them, and seemed careful in her motions, but did things easily, and soon all these newborns had been rubbed and had sopped their fill of the beaker's juices that had been laden by the creature, and the newborns squatted in newly formed rows of them, and each was surely frightened, as it likely modeled hellish scenarios vis-a-vis its future, as had its ancestors, since even before things moved on their own accord through the world. Kumi's movements looked to have lost their aggressions toward the puddle and her home, and her movements slowed, and her irises shone with scenes being given their good time, and did convey the world as more settled. By the look of it, Kumi too had taken a sopping, as her fingers and palms looked like wrinkled chalk, and her eyebrow too was shadowed by a dry swipe of the seafloor creature's juices, and her nostrils looked lit with a powdery glow, and her lips must have kissed 2 fingers in a pause to watch a thought. One, if one were keeping up, would see the juices of the seafloor creature strung out in liquid filaments snaking through Kumi's body, being stroked like fly casts within the dark waters that were nourishing all things within her, and one would see the creature's particles holding tight to thin eddies and being pushed and paused in the 2 beats and the rest of the liquid waltz through the walled garden of her inner workings. The particulate juices of the seafloor creature were drawn thin by the mandates of the pause and flow, sometimes passing brethren particles, lodged and hidden in her perfect body's defects that are born from the ubiquitous and untidy limits of perfect paradigms. And many looked to be particles fugitive from the stratified incantations of the workbench, or from barrel kiln firings, while her smokes rose in casual sacrifice to the fickler gods of chaos, and now were the offerings hunkered unseen in the dark, as if awaiting their purpose. Narrowing tubes rooted through her, each root having smelled itself into being, and each root having its own roots, and were as many as could by themselves render her likeness, and narrowed to the size of the things of their own making, whereupon the dark waters pushed and paused into the cluttered spaces of things that spoke in magnetic phrases, and mingled with phrases stolen from the confused world beyond the borders of her skin, and were conferred here by few and guarded means into the darkness of living that broods within all opaque creatures. Kumi's body stood, one assumes, owing only to these magnetic phrases that had once spoken in but a single and magnificent language, yet now blurted in a cacophony of 1,000,000,000 tongues, where most seemed gibberish to all but their cliques, and their cliques within their cliques, and they kept to their burrows and made things unique to them, and made them from those with whom they could reason as they waltzed within the pausing flow of the dark waters. There are surely some things sad or unknowing in this uncaring vastness that are brutalized into being, as when Titan suns absorb dusts that are innocent in their circumstance, and yet are squeezed into purified otherlings, or brunt-born into precious metals. But even these hardened things, one supposes, will at last fall away toward the dissolution of time, and will one day vanish into the eternal thinness that is nothing. And yet here Kumi stood undissolved and opaque, and within her looked to be instead a coming together, a condensation, with magnetic phrases in seeming negotiation to resolve their place in the vastness, and mingling with other phrases with reflective intent, awash in numbers without account, perhaps still brutalizing each other, but at their own scale and on their own individual terms, negotiated as had been the terms of those who came before them, and yet are unquestionably still within them. It had been 3 weeks since she and Giuseppe had communed in the frigid darkness under the hot covers and the rising billows of amber breath, back when her garden's walls had been breached, and his slithering otherlings raided her fruit and had begun their brutish negotiations to corrupt it, and she defended her fruit selfishly, and she rejected the otherlings, and their numbers were great, and they persisted, and one particular of the Slytherin found the place where she could not resist, or would not, as if she was ready, and she took the Slytherin otherling in, whereupon every part of her, two apart, was mirrored by every part of the otherling, part for part, in a coming together, in a condensation, in a contract with him as binding as could be bound. It is likely certain, from the look of it alone, that this coming together was conducted by something with thoughtful intent and with discernment that would accept or reject and know the outcome of its concerns, surely, as it looks to be precise and practiced, and each element known of its intricate part, and would be far beyond unlikely if such business was from thoughtless matter alone. Surely thoughtlessness could not continue to trip into precise and practical order that works itself out like masterful magnetic music, each attractive and repulsive melody leading to the next, each melody absorbed and disappearing as substrate into the masterpiece, as if by design. These matters can only be thoughtful, no doubt, and thoughtfulness can surely only be born from thoughtfulness, and to think otherwise can only be the fruit of blindness or willful neglect. To see this as a certainty, one need only look about and see what is in the making, and work the odds, and be minimally aware. And one was surely aware of this manifest thoughtfulness within Kumi's womb, as bundles upon bundles split into themselves and smelled themselves into their burrows and into their cliques and into their cliques within cliques, as if knowing their fates, each knowing its fate from endless fates, no matter their tininess or seeming simplicity, as if expressing an ethereal knowledge and conforming to its meditations, yet in utter autonomy, and yet again in community, as if their trillion fates were within each of them, and so a trillion parts to perform, and each part being different, even if subtly, or if even absurdly, while their performances seemed cued as if overseen by some conscientious conductor, intimate with each phrase they are composed, and with each note wrote therein, and giving stern glances to stragglers and to those thinking stray thoughts, and appeared to be unaware of the stroking of the wand. If one were ever true to one's thoughts, and shucked away the this and therefore of the world's fibered ratios, and would ask one's self what one truly knows, it would be that this is a conjuring, and is conjured by something thoughtful, surely, and that this should be stated as a certainty, and upon that certainty likely all certainty should rest, and help further refine those lurking certainties one hears quietly spoken to from the long shadows of the ancients. And what may be left for a better time, when one is stricken by a more callous mood, could be the quizzical matter of the mechanism by which one's mindful conjuring makes motile these marionettes, as there must be some spot where one's mindfulness at last abuts matter, some place where a conjuring is made manifest so that the work may be done, and not merely spoken to within one's meditations, no matter how persuasive. And surely this place is small, no doubt diminutive, so as to facilitate a conjuring with the most minimal of effort, unless effort is of no concern to such a one, and these diminutive spots are everywhere and saturate the immensity and are likely eternal, and so perhaps invigorating one with an eternal urge to keep up, as surely one could, if anyone could. Otherwise, if one did not keep up or could not, then on occasion, in some small ways, the inevitable limits of one's perfect intent may be reached, and unattended matters may progress as a matter of circumstance, and be drawn forth into the tight eddies of mindless, or worse, malevolent resolve. But here, in Kumi's womb, the conductor's wand drew its limits amidst the magnetic musicians who followed faithfully what was writ, some quiet while clearing spittle or their palms pressing to silence timpani, and some engaged while sharing triads or while droning deep phrases that surely usher forth one's long memories of from where one comes. But here, in Kumi's womb, as there always is in perfect places, there too is the creature that has swum from the seafloor to hear waltzing within her, and within these new bundles of bundles as they sniff themselves into their own making, and, if not obscured by the creature's slithering interludes, would be abiding by one's conductive advices, and would embody their relevance to the scrolls of scribbled mandates, note for note, beat for beat, or would otherwise be waiting in anxious knots and watching for the moment where one passes to them a glance and a stroke of the wand. But here, in some parts of this perfect place, one's intent may have gone unnoticed, while obscured behind the passing creature's dark and mercurial influence, and some magnetic musicians may have been led plumb astray. Then once the seafloor creature had passed, the magnetic music may have moved on to other phrases, conveying new sensibilities different from their prescribed plan, further across and down the curled page, but still clear and precisely described by the wand there now being waved, and its perfections proceeding as bundles of bundles smell themselves into perfect but alternative burrows of well-ordered clicks, speaking their alternative tongues. Here in Kumi's womb, the creature swam through and about each of the bundles of bundles that were pausing and playing the aromatic music as they continued to smell themselves into being, and after a time of this, from the music emerged two grubs, or perhaps krill, or what seemed soon could be tadpoles, and they were tethered to Kumi's walled garden, and were otherwise floating abandoned and diminutive amidst the entirety of the universe, and left alone to enter into negotiations with its immensity. And surely the grubby tadpoles would have been fodder to the whims of perfect chaos, if not for their ancients and their sage advices as they and the grubs together took from the scattered fragments of chaos and inducted themselves into the seeming perpetuity of ordered being. As one might see in all grubby tadpoles, or at a minimum seeing most, would be there abiding to the inductions of the aromatic music as devoted membranes and fibers that fall toward the gravity of their surrounds, and they all, save the anomalous, save the pilgrims of limits, honor their ancients by reenacting their victories, epoch for epoch, as glycerin replicas of what came before, or not so much replicas as their ancients' actual bodies, just as they were when they first appeared in the world, before innumerable serpentine interludes challenged them to conduct themselves contrarily, some well and some not so well, and thus provide new epochs to be included in the stream of glistening embodiments of their progeny's lore. As one could see here in Kumi's womb, their tethers were strange, as an arch spanned between the grubby tadpoles, wherein the dark waters flowed toward one of them, and flowed backward within it, and then flowed out to the other tadpole, not as one would expect where their mother would be providing for both tadpoles without hierarchy, and she surely did not harbor maliciousness upon one tadpole to favor the other, one presumes. And of the two grubby tadpoles, one had no headbud, and did not beat at its core, and the other headbud looked fruitful, and its core beat just as did beat the cores of all its ancestors, still living within it. And the one beating pushed the dark waters selflessly to the heartless sibling, who drew in its sustenance, and thinned the dark waters, and returned the waters as spent to the pumping twin, who in response grew meagerly, except for its laboring heart and gorging, as its witless and heartless sibling grew fat and excreted fluids in thoughtless excess. Surely no good can come from this, and it must have been that one was merely unaware of such tragic iniquities, perhaps due to this being one infinitesimal circumstance in an immensity of infinitesimal circumstances with which to keep up, and thus would rightly absolve one from accusations of malevolence. Or perhaps one merely cared not to know while in one's unavoidable ho-hum of unbounded ability. Or perhaps one looked upon the headless grub with disgust, long-honed. Or it could be one foresaw the untidiness of infinite responsibilities that are the heavy shadows of infinite awareness, and so prepared measures at the onset, when immensity's notion was merely as spoken of amongst one's selves, before matters abutment with the conjuring, where decisions were made and limits were drawn, and thus the heartless clockworks excreted their subsequent balance of serpentine fluids all throughout immensity's purity. It could be that serpents indeed have minds, and have minds enough that they harbor thoughtful malevolence of their own manufacture. Or are serpents merely malice's innocent embodiment, where malevolence is like water, and is siphoned through serpents, and is left to flow into the fractal crevices of their surrounds? It likely was thus for the seafloor creatures. Its juices were siphoned through these grubby tadpoles, and thereby muffled whole measures of the aromatic melodies. And after a time of this, a feature much like an ear hole or mouth spot appeared on the tether near the heartless and mindless grub, as if it would be a mouth to speak the tether's witless mind, and the mouth pit became more so, and broadened its girth, and the dark waters soon trickled thinly past the mouth pit's presence, and the dark waters were thereby impeded, and the tether withered, and the heartless marionette hung from it, and soon lost its vigor, and soon after, too, its color. And so the heartless grub looked vacant beyond the ample vacancies afforded it by its absence of mind. And now the pumping grub was alone, and its heart pumped only for itself, and it drank in the richness of the dark waters, and so made more of itself, while the vacant grub sloughed toward looser constraints, and toward being limitless, and had embarked upon a fragmentation whose pieces vanished more so into the watery acids of its own making. If there had been light within Kumi's opaque womb, light with which to watch the grub that remained, the grub that was still condensate, one would likely notice two shadows suggested upon the grub's convoluting headbud that, by their placement alone, were surely to be eyes with which the grub would someday see. And if one looked closely, one might see these shadows boiling with countless infinitesimal doppelgangers, each doppelganger seeming to smell its own way in and around the headbud, or otherwise wander therein without particular resolve. And one would see that from one side of each shadow, fingered filaments grab their way deeper into the headbud, to who knows where, while otherwise the shadows seemed to fall into themselves until they were as shallow eyeballs with which one could imagine the grub stared upon its own convoluted manufacture. Perhaps the eyeballs watched shadows instead, and so might explain the effort of their making. And the sibling eyeballs, left and right, both seemed to engage in an ancient and orderly process wherein they rounded into globes, looking like young tulips atop draping and stalky filaments, and looked to mirror each to the other in every detail, that is, but for the place from where the fingered filaments climbed away from the tulip bowls and reached back into the headbud. Here, under one of the tulips, under the left tulip, at the place where the tulip became stalk and the stalk became tulip, its stalk was forked like a serpentine tongue, and one spline of the fork was perfect, as was the perfect stalk of the right tulip, as both their stalks reached back to where stalks of eyeballs would reach into a grubby tadpole's gelatin mind. But the other spline of the left stalk, instead of being topped with a third tulip, a third eyeball, looked instead to have snaked into different burrows of the grubby tadpole's headbud, to where it might speak the tongues of the clicks that call those burrows their own.